You will own nothing, and you will be happy. The plan was not imagined. It was published. This is the full story.
Every January, in a small alpine resort town in eastern Switzerland, the most powerful people on Earth gather behind closed doors. Heads of state, prime ministers, central bank governors, the chief executives of the world's largest corporations, billionaire philanthropists, celebrity activists, and select members of the media converge on Davos, population 11,000, for 4 days of panels, presentations, networking dinners, and private meetings that are not recorded, not transcribed, and not open to public scrutiny. The Congress Center, a modernist glass and concrete structure that serves as the event's main venue, is surrounded by security cordons, Swiss military checkpoints, and police from multiple jurisdictions. The annual meeting of the World Economic Forum is the most exclusive, most heavily guarded, and most influential private gathering in the world. And for a growing number of people across the political spectrum, it is the clearest evidence that the world is governed not by elected representatives, but by an unaccountable elite that meets on a mountaintop to decide humanity's future. The World Economic Forum was founded in 1971 by Klaus Schwab, a German-born engineer and economist who had studied at Harvard University under Henry Kissinger. Originally called the European Management Forum, it was conceived as a platform for European business leaders to discuss modern management techniques. Schwab's genius was institutional design. He created a space where corporate executives, government officials, academics, and civil society representatives could interact as equals, free from the constraints of formal diplomatic protocol. The rebranding as the World Economic Forum in 1987 reflected its growing ambition, no longer merely a European management conference, but a global platform for multi-stakeholder governance. The idea that the world's most complex problems could best be addressed through collaboration between sectors rather than through governmental action alone. Schwab's intellectual contribution to public policy centered on the concept of stakeholder capitalism, the argument that corporations should serve not only their shareholders, but a broader set of stakeholders, including employees, communities, and the environment. This idea, while mainstream in corporate governance academic circles, occupied a contested position in the broader political landscape. For its advocates, stakeholder capitalism represented a necessary evolution of market economics, an acknowledgement that corporations operate within societies and have responsibilities beyond profit maximization. For its critics on the right, it was socialism by another name, an attempt to subordinate private enterprise to social and environmental agendas dictated by unelected elites. For its critics on the left, it was corporate greenwashing, a rhetorical strategy that allowed corporations to present themselves as socially responsible while continuing business as usual.
The forum's real power lies not in any formal authority. It has none, but in its unparalleled convening function. The relationships formed at Davos, the ideas circulated in its panels and publications, and the shared frameworks developed in its workshops influence the thinking of decision-makers across governments and industries worldwide. When the same concepts appear simultaneously in policy documents from multiple governments, the explanation may not be conspiracy, but convergence, the result of influential people absorbing the same ideas from the same source. But convergence and conspiracy can look identical from the outside, and the WEF's position as the source of so many simultaneously adopted ideas has made it a natural target for suspicion. The most controversial element of the WEF's institutional architecture is the Young Global Leaders Program, launched in 2004 as a successor to the earlier Global Leaders for Tomorrow program. Each year, the forum identifies approximately 100 exceptional young individuals, typically in their 30s and 40s, for a 5-year membership program designed to develop their leadership capabilities through engagement with the WEF's networks and resources. The program has approximately 1,400 alumni across 120 nationalities. The alumni list reads like a who's who of global leadership: Emmanuel Macron, Jacinda Ardern, Justin Trudeau, Pete Buttigieg, Annalena Baerbock, and dozens of other current and former heads of state, cabinet ministers, and corporate leaders have been young global leaders. The controversy over the Young Global Leaders program crystallized around a single video clip that became one of the most shared pieces of content in the Great Reset conspiracy ecosystem. In a 2017 interview at the Harvard Kennedy School, Klaus Schwab said, "I have to say that when I mention names like Mrs. Merkel, even Vladimir Putin, and so on, they have all been young global leaders of the World Economic Forum. And I think we penetrate the cabinet. So yesterday I was at a reception for Prime Minister Trudeau, and I know that more than half of his cabinet are actually young global leaders of the World Economic Forum." The word penetrate, apparently an awkward English expression for reach or influence, was seized upon as an explicit admission of elite infiltration of democratic governments. The clip was viewed tens of millions of times and became the cornerstone of the conspiracy theory's evidence base. The benign interpretation of the Young Global Leaders program is straightforward. The WEF identifies ambitious young professionals who are likely to become future leaders, and some of them do, in fact, become leaders, because ambition and talent predict advancement in any field. The program does not place operatives in government. It recruits people who are already on trajectories toward leadership. Angela Merkel did not become Chancellor of Germany because of the WEF. The WEF invited her because she was clearly a rising force in German politics. The program is a talent identification and networking initiative, not a conspiracy to infiltrate democratic governments. The conspiratorial interpretation is equally straightforward. The world's most powerful private organization systematically recruits young politicians, trains them in its ideology, connects them to a global network of like-minded elites, and celebrates when they assume positions of governmental power. Whether or not the WEF directly controls these politicians, the result is the same: a global elite that shares common training, common networks, common vocabulary, and common policy priorities, operating across national borders and outside democratic accountability. The distinction between influence and control matters in theory. In practice, to citizens who feel that their governments serve elite interests rather than popular ones, the distinction may be less meaningful than it appears. The Davos attendee list itself is a source of legitimate concern that transcends conspiracy thinking. The annual meeting brings together approximately 3,000 participants, including dozens of heads of state and government, hundreds of corporate executives, central bank governors, international organization heads, and selected media figures.
The cost of attendance, including membership fees that can reach several $100,000 per year for the forum's strategic partners, ensures that the gathering is exclusively composed of the wealthy and powerful. The agenda is set by the WEF, not by democratic processes. The discussions are not subject to public scrutiny. The relationships formed and deals struck are not disclosed. Whatever one thinks of the Great Reset conspiracy theory, the concentration of so much decision-making power in a private forum with no democratic accountability raises questions that deserve serious engagement rather than dismissal.
It is in this context, a private organization with genuine influence over global decision-making, a charismatic founder with a tendency toward grandiose rhetoric, a talent program that has produced an extraordinary number of world leaders, and an annual gathering that concentrates more power per square meter than any other event on Earth, that the Great Reset conspiracy theory emerged. The conspiracy theory did not need to invent its raw material. The raw material was freely available, published on the WEF's own website, promoted in the WEF's own publications, and broadcast from the WEF's own stages. What the conspiracy theory did was interpret that material through the lens of malicious intent, transforming policy proposals into evil plans, networking into infiltration, and influence into control. The question at the heart of the Great Reset debate is not whether the WEF has an agenda. It is whether that agenda is what the conspiracy theory claims it is. You will own nothing, and you will be happy. 8 words that became the most potent and most misrepresented slogan in modern conspiracy culture. The phrase originated in a 2016 video published on the World Economic Forum's social media accounts, accompanied by an article by Danish politician Ida Auken, a member of the Danish parliament and a young global leader. Auken's article was titled, "Welcome to 2030. I own nothing, have no privacy, and life has never been better." It was clearly framed as speculative fiction, an imaginative exercise in which a narrator describes what city life might look like in 2030 if sharing and subscription economies replaced private ownership for most goods and services. The article was one of several commissioned by the WEF, exploring possible future scenarios. It was not a policy prescription, not a WEF position paper, and not a statement of organizational intent. The article itself was nuanced and even ambivalent. Auken's fictional narrator describes a future in which transportation, housing, and consumer goods are shared rather than owned, a world of subscriptions and access rather than possession. The narrator acknowledges the convenience of this arrangement, but also expresses unease. Once in a while, I get a bit tired of all the renting and sharing. My biggest concern is all those people who do not live in our city, those we lost on the way, those who decided that it became too much, all this technology. The article was, in other words, not a utopian endorsement of property abolition, but a thought experiment that explicitly acknowledged potential problems. None of this nuance survived the phrase's extraction and viral distribution.
The transformation of Ida Auken's speculative article into evidence of elite conspiracy followed a pattern that media scholars call context collapse. The WEF's social media team created a video and social media cards that featured the most provocative phrases from the article as standalone statements, including "you will own nothing and you will be happy," without the speculative framing, the nuance, or the ambivalence of the original text.
These decontextualized cards were designed to generate engagement, likes, shares, comments, and they succeeded spectacularly, though not in the way the WEF intended. The cards were screenshotted, reposted, and shared millions of times as evidence that the World Economic Forum was openly planning to strip citizens of their property rights. The viral spread of the phrase was accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. When governments around the world implemented lockdowns, business closures, and restrictions on movement and commerce, measures that did temporarily restrict citizens' ability to use their property and businesses, the phrase, "You will own nothing and you will be happy," seemed to many people not like a future scenario, but a present reality. The pandemic provided the emotional context that transformed an obscure WEF social media post into an international rallying cry. For people who had lost businesses, been unable to access their properties, or been forced to accept government mandates about how they could use their own homes and bodies, the phrase, "You will own nothing and you will be happy," felt like a taunt from the architects of their misery. The WEF's response to the controversy was slow, inadequate, and ultimately counterproductive. The forum initially defended the article as a legitimate exercise in scenario planning. When the backlash intensified, the WEF published clarifications stating that the article represented the views of its author, not the forum, and that the scenario it described was one of many possible futures, not a desired outcome. These clarifications were published on the WEF's website, a platform with a tiny fraction of the reach of the social media channels where the phrase was circulating. The clarification reached thousands. The conspiracy interpretation reached millions. By the time the WEF understood the scale of the problem, the phrase had become the defining meme of the Great Reset conspiracy theory, beyond any possibility of context restoration.
The property rights dimension of the controversy touched a nerve that was deeper than any single phrase. Private property is, in many Western democracies, considered a fundamental right, enshrined in constitutions, protected by law, and regarded by millions of citizens as the foundation of economic freedom and personal autonomy. Any perceived threat to property rights, however theoretical, however speculative, however clearly framed as fiction, triggers a visceral political response. The phrase, "You will own nothing," activated this response at a moment when property rights felt genuinely threatened by pandemic-era government interventions. It did not matter that the WEF had no authority to implement any policy related to property rights. What mattered was that the most visible organization of global elites appeared to be celebrating a future in which ordinary citizens owned nothing. The phrase also functioned as what communications theorists call a condensation symbol, a compact, emotionally charged phrase that condenses a complex set of anxieties into a single memorable expression. "You will own nothing and you will be happy" simultaneously expressed fears about property rights, economic inequality, elite contempt, loss of autonomy, corporate surveillance, and the subordination of individual freedom to collective management. Each person who encountered the phrase could project their own specific anxiety onto it. For libertarians, it represented the abolition of property rights. For conservatives, it represented socialism. For the working class, it represented elite contempt for their economic aspirations. For privacy advocates, it represented total surveillance. The phrase's power lay precisely in its ambiguity. It could mean whatever the listener feared most.
The irony of the situation was that the conspiracy theory's most powerful piece of evidence was not hidden or secret, but publicly promoted by the WEF itself. Unlike traditional conspiracy theories that must point to classified documents or whistleblower testimony, the Great Reset conspiracy theory could point to the WEF's own website, the WEF's own publications, and the WEF's own social media posts. This made the Great Reset uniquely difficult to debunk. The standard conspiracy theory response to debunking is they are hiding the truth, but in this case, the alleged truth was freely available. The conspiracy theory did not need to discover secret evidence. It needed only to interpret public evidence through the lens of malicious intent.
The legacy of "you will own nothing and you will be happy" extends beyond the Great Reset conspiracy theory itself. The phrase has become a touchstone in broader political discourse about inequality, digital economy, and the future of capitalism. It appears in parliamentary debates, in protest signs, in academic papers, and in mainstream media commentary. It has become a shorthand for elite disconnection from the concerns of ordinary citizens, a shorthand that retains its power regardless of its original context. The WEF created a phrase that escaped their control, acquired a meaning they did not intend, and became a permanent feature of the political landscape. It is perhaps the most consequential act of unintentional communication in 21st century public life. On June 3, 2020, with the world 3 months into the most severe pandemic in a century, the World Economic Forum and Charles, Prince of Wales, now King Charles III, launched the Great Reset Initiative. The timing was extraordinary. Billions of people were confined to their homes. Millions had lost their jobs. Global supply chains were disrupted. Democratic legislatures were sidelined by emergency executive powers. Schools were closed. Small businesses were dying. And into this chaos, the world's most prominent private organization for global elite coordination announced that it had a plan to use the crisis as an opportunity to fundamentally restructure the global economy. The phrase, "never let a good crisis go to waste," attributed to various political figures, was suddenly being enacted on a global scale. And the WEF was doing it in public with a book launch and a multimedia campaign. Schwab's book, COVID-19, The Great Reset, co-authored with Thierry Malaret and published in July 2020 with remarkable speed, argued that the pandemic represented a unique opportunity for positive economic transformation. The book called for stakeholder capitalism to replace shareholder-only capitalism, for green investment in sustainable infrastructure, for ESG metrics to guide corporate accountability, and for greater coordination between governments and international institutions. The proposals were, in substance, extensions of ideas Schwab had been promoting for decades. They were not new. They were not radical by the standards of mainstream economics, and they did not call for the abolition of private property or the installation of totalitarian government. But their packaging, the word reset, the explicit framing of the pandemic as an opportunity, and the speed of publication conveyed a message that many people found deeply disturbing.
The Event 201 pandemic simulation conducted in October 2019, just 2 months before COVID-19 emerged, became a central exhibit in the conspiracy theory's evidence base. The simulation, co-hosted by the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the World Economic Forum, gathered 15 high-level leaders from business, government, and public health to simulate the global response to a novel coronavirus pandemic. The simulation scenario involved a fictional pathogen called CAPS, a coronavirus that caused respiratory illness and spread through asymptomatic transmission. The parallels to the actual COVID-19 pandemic were striking enough to alarm conspiracy theorists, even though pandemic preparedness exercises are routine public health activities conducted regularly by governments and international organizations. The synchronized language used by world leaders in the pandemic's aftermath provided further fuel. Multiple heads of state and government, including Joe Biden, Boris Johnson, Justin Trudeau, Scott Morrison, and Jacinda Ardern, simultaneously adopted the phrase "Build Back Better" as their post-COVID economic recovery slogan. The phrase was, in fact, drawn from a publicly available United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Framework that had been in use since 2015. Its simultaneous adoption by multiple governments reflected the UN framework's influence on national policy, not covert WEF programming. But to citizens already primed to see coordination as conspiracy, the identical language across different countries, different political parties, and different continents looked like evidence of a single organizing intelligence dictating the terms of recovery. The lockdowns themselves became a component of the conspiracy theory. The unprecedented restrictions on movement, commerce, assembly, and worship implemented by governments worldwide during 2020 and 2021 represented the most extensive peacetime curtailment of civil liberties in the history of democratic governance. Whether these measures were necessary public health interventions or disproportionate governmental overreach remains a legitimate political debate. But for conspiracy theorists, the lockdowns were not a response to the pandemic. They were the pandemic's purpose. COVID was engineered, in this view, specifically to create the conditions under which the Great Reset could be implemented. A terrified population, a devastated economy, and governments exercising emergency powers outside normal democratic constraints.
The vaccine mandates and health passport systems implemented in many countries during 2021 and 2022 deepened the conspiracy theory's hold. Requiring proof of vaccination for access to workplaces, restaurants, travel, and public events represented for many people an unprecedented intrusion of government authority into personal medical decisions. The digital infrastructure required to implement these systems, QR codes, centralized databases, real-time verification, demonstrated the technical feasibility of a digital surveillance system that could track citizens' compliance with government mandates in real time. For conspiracy theorists, vaccine passports were not a temporary public health measure, but a prototype, the beta version of a permanent digital identity system that would eventually track all human activity. The global coordination of pandemic response was, by historical standards, genuinely remarkable. The speed and similarity with which governments across different political systems, different cultures, and different continents implemented similar policies, lockdowns, mask mandates, social distancing, vaccine prioritization, economic stimulus, exceeded what most citizens expected from international cooperation. This coordination was explained by public health officials as the rational response to a common threat, guided by shared scientific understanding and the recommendations of the World Health Organization. But the coordination also raised legitimate questions about the mechanisms of global governance, questions that the conspiracy theory answered with a simple explanation: the WEF told them what to do.
The Great Reset conspiracy theory's success in the pandemic context illustrates a fundamental vulnerability of democratic governance. When governments act rapidly, in coordination, and in ways that restrict civil liberties, they generate the conditions for conspiracy theory formation, even when their actions are justified. The speed of response looks like pre-planning. Coordination looks like conspiracy. Restriction looks like oppression. Emergency powers look like the first step toward permanent authoritarianism. These perceptions are not irrational. They are the reasonable concerns of citizens who have been taught to be vigilant about government overreach and who have historical precedent for that vigilance. The challenge for democratic societies is to respond to genuine crises without creating the perception or the reality of illegitimate power concentration.
The pandemic window through which the Great Reset conspiracy theory entered public consciousness has not fully closed. Even as COVID restrictions have been largely lifted and vaccine passport systems discontinued, the memory of what governments were willing to do and the suspicion of what they might do next has permanently altered the relationship between many citizens and their governments. The Great Reset conspiracy theory did not merely describe a future fear, it crystallized an existing fear that the pandemic had made visceral. The fear that in a moment of crisis, the institutions we trust to protect our freedom might instead seize the opportunity to curtail it. The Great Reset conspiracy theory is not a single theory. It's a blender, a narrative framework so capacious and so adaptable that it can absorb and unify virtually every pre-existing conspiracy theory into a single coherent story of pandemic-enabled global elite takeover. Researchers who study conspiracy theory ecosystems have described it as a conspiracy smoothie, a blend of ingredients from dozens of different theories mixed together by the Great Reset narrative into something that tastes new while containing nothing that was not already on the menu. Understanding the Great Reset requires understanding not just its specific claims, but its structural function as a meta-conspiracy, a theory about theories, a framework that connects dots across the entire conspiracy landscape. The New World Order theory, the granddaddy of modern political conspiracy theories, claiming that a secret elite is working to establish a totalitarian one-world government, provides the Great Reset's deepest roots. The Great Reset is, in structural terms, simply the latest version of the New World Order narrative, updated with 21st century specifics. Where the NWO theory pointed to the United Nations, the Trilateral Commission, and the Council on Foreign Relations as the instruments of elite coordination, the Great Reset theory points to the WEF, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the World Health Organization. The institutional cast has changed, but the plot remains the same. A small group of unelected elites is secretly working to establish global governance at the expense of national sovereignty and individual freedom. COVID-specific conspiracy theories, including claims that the virus was engineered in a laboratory, that the pandemic was planned or exaggerated to serve political purposes, and that vaccines contain microchips, graphene oxide, or genetic modification agents, were seamlessly integrated into the Great Reset framework. The Great Reset narrative provided these disparate claims with a unified motive. The pandemic and the vaccination campaign were not ends in themselves, but means to an end. The establishment of digital control systems, the destruction of small businesses to benefit corporate monopolies, and the psychological conditioning of populations to accept government control over their bodies and movements. The financial conspiracy theories about central bank digital currencies, the replacement of cash with traceable digital money, and the use of programmable currencies to control citizen behavior found their most natural home in the Great Reset framework. The WEF had, in fact, published extensively about the potential of CBDCs and digital financial infrastructure, providing conspiracy theorists with a wealth of primary source material.
The Great Reset narrative transformed legitimate policy discussions about financial innovation into evidence of a plan to establish total financial surveillance, a cashless society in which every transaction would be tracked, every purchase approved or denied by algorithmic systems, and every citizen's financial life subject to government control. The dietary conspiracy theories claims that the WEF planned to force citizens to eat insects while elites continued consuming meat drew on real WEF publications about sustainable food systems and insect protein as an alternative to resource-intensive animal agriculture. These discussions, conducted in the context of genuine environmental and food security challenges, were reinterpreted as evidence of a two-tiered food system in which the masses would be degraded to insect consumption, while the Davos elite dined on Wagyu beef. The emotional power of this claim, the visceral disgust at the idea of being forced to eat insects, combined with the rage at perceived elite hypocrisy, made it one of the most viral and emotionally potent elements of the Great Reset conspiracy theory.
The urban planning conspiracy theories, particularly the reinterpretation of 15-minute cities as open-air prisons, demonstrated the Great Reset framework's ability to absorb even the most benign policy discussions. The 15-minute city concept, developed by French Colombian urbanist Carlos Moreno, is a transportation planning approach that aims to ensure that all daily necessities, work, shopping, healthcare, education, leisure, are accessible within a 15-minute walk or bicycle ride, reducing car dependency and improving quality of life. The conspiracy interpretation reversed the concept's intended meaning. Instead of making the entire city more accessible, the 15-minute city was reinterpreted as a system of geographic confinement, designated zones beyond which citizens would not be permitted to travel. The anti-Semitic dimension of the Great Reset conspiracy theory follows a well-established pattern. George Soros and the Rothschild family appear prominently in Great Reset conspiracy narratives as the financial powers behind the WEF agenda. The integration of these figures, who feature in virtually every modern anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, into the Great Reset framework connects the theory to centuries-old traditions of anti-Semitic conspiracy thinking, while providing plausible deniability through the framing of criticism as being about globalism rather than any specific ethnic or religious group. Researchers have documented extensive overlap between Great Reset conspiracy communities and communities that promote explicitly anti-Semitic content. The meta-conspiracy function of the Great Reset is its most significant structural innovation. By providing a single narrative that explains why the pandemic happened, why lockdowns were imposed, why vaccines were pushed, why digital currencies are being developed, why meat is being criticized, why cities are being redesigned, and why the same people keep appearing at the same conferences, the Great Reset theory satisfies a cognitive need that individual conspiracy theories cannot. The need for a unified explanation of everything. Each individual theory, COVID was engineered, vaccines are dangerous, CBDCs will enable surveillance, might be debunked, but when all of them are connected within the Great Reset framework, the debunking of any single theory does not damage the overall narrative. The framework is greater than the sum of its parts.
The political versatility of the Great Reset conspiracy theory is unprecedented among modern conspiracy theories. It appeals simultaneously to the libertarian right, the Great Reset as socialism and the abolition of property rights, the populist right, the Great Reset as elite cosmopolitan contempt for ordinary people, the anti-corporate left, the Great Reset as corporate capture of democratic governance, and the environmentalist left,
the Great Reset as greenwashing that uses environmental rhetoric to justify surveillance and control. This cross-spectrum appeal has made the Great Reset the most politically versatile conspiracy theory of the 21st century, a rare phenomenon that unites Fox News viewers and Occupy Wall Street activists in a shared narrative of elite betrayal. The technological fears embedded in the Great Reset conspiracy theory are not entirely unfounded, and that is precisely what makes them dangerous. Unlike many conspiracy theories that rest on entirely fabricated claims, the Great Reset theory takes real technological developments, real policy discussions, and real civil liberties concerns and extrapolates them to their most extreme possible conclusions. Central bank digital currencies are real. Digital identity systems are being developed. Smart city surveillance infrastructure is being deployed. These are not inventions of conspiracy theorists. They are documented trends with genuine implications for privacy, autonomy, and democratic governance. The conspiracy theory's innovation is not in identifying these trends, but in interpreting them as components of a coordinated, intentional plan for totalitarian control. Central bank digital currencies represent the most technically substantial concern within the Great Reset conspiracy theory. As of 2025, over 100 countries are actively researching or developing CBDCs, including the European Central Bank's digital euro, the People's Bank of China's digital yuan, already in large-scale trials, and various Federal Reserve research initiatives. CBDCs differ from existing digital payment systems in a fundamental way. They would be direct liabilities of the central bank rather than commercial bank deposits, potentially giving the issuing authority unprecedented visibility into and control over the financial transactions of every citizen. The conspiracy theories claim that CBDCs could be programmed to expire, to be restricted to approved purchases, or to be shut off as punishment is technically accurate. These capabilities are inherent in programmable digital money.
The distinction between technical capability and policy intent is crucial, but easily blurred. A CBDC could theoretically be programmed to restrict purchases, just as any digital system could theoretically be used for surveillance. But the question is not whether such capabilities exist, they do, but whether democratic governance frameworks would permit their deployment. Multiple CBDC designs under development include explicit privacy provisions. Legislative debates in democratic countries have focused specifically on preventing the surveillance capabilities that conspiracy theorists fear. The European Central Bank's digital euro project, for example, has included privacy as a fundamental design principle. The conspiracy theory treats the worst-case scenario as the intended outcome, ignoring the policy debates, legislative constraints, and democratic safeguards that shape how technology is actually deployed. The vaccine passport experience provided the conspiracy theory with its most tangible evidence of digital control. During 2021 and 2022, many countries implemented systems requiring proof of COVID vaccination for access to workplaces, restaurants, public events, and international travel. These systems varied in implementation, from simple paper certificates to sophisticated QR code-based apps with real-time verification, but they all shared a common feature. They made participation in normal social and economic life conditional on compliance with a government health mandate. For many citizens, this represented a fundamental change in the relationship between individual and state, the introduction of a digital compliance infrastructure that had no precedent in peacetime democratic governance. The 15-minute city controversy illustrates how the conspiracy theory transforms benign policy into sinister control. The concept, as developed by urbanist Carlos Moreno and adopted by cities including Paris, Melbourne, and Oxford, is straightforward.
Design urban environments so that essential services, shops, schools, healthcare, parks, workplaces are accessible within a 15-minute walk or bicycle ride from any residence. The goal is to reduce car dependency, decrease commuting time, improve air quality, and create more livable neighborhoods. The concept does not restrict movement. There are no barriers, no checkpoints, no permission requirements. Citizens can travel anywhere they wish. The 15-minute city simply reduces the need to travel far for daily necessities.
The conspiracy interpretation reversed the concept entirely. In conspiracy theory forums and media, the 15-minute city became an open-air prison, a system of geographical zones within which citizens would be confined, with travel beyond zone boundaries restricted, monitored, or prohibited. This interpretation was fueled by the coincidental implementation of low-traffic neighborhoods and congestion charging zones in cities like Oxford, where traffic filters were installed to reduce car traffic in residential areas. The filters, which redirect car traffic but do not prevent pedestrian or bicycle access, were described by conspiracy theorists as zone boundaries for citizen confinement. Protests were organized. Death threats were made against city councilors. Traffic cameras were vandalized. The smart city infrastructure that the WEF has enthusiastically promoted, including sensors, cameras, data analytics, and Internet of Things networks, does raise genuine privacy and surveillance concerns that are taken seriously by privacy advocates, civil liberties organizations, and democratic oversight bodies worldwide. The deployment of facial recognition technology, automated number plate recognition, and environmental sensors in urban environments creates a data infrastructure that could, in the wrong hands, enable extensive surveillance of citizens' movements and activities. These concerns are not conspiracy theories. They are the subject of active democratic policy debate in every democratic country deploying smart city technology. The gap between legitimate concern and conspiracy theory is defined by the attribution of intent. Privacy advocates who worry about smart city surveillance propose specific regulatory safeguards, data protection laws, algorithmic transparency requirements, independent oversight bodies, and limitations on government access to collected data. They work within democratic processes to shape technology governance. Conspiracy theorists who worry about the same technology attribute its deployment to a deliberate plan for totalitarian control, a plan orchestrated by the WEF and implemented by infiltrated governments. The first response empowers citizens within democratic frameworks. The second response encourages distrust of all democratic institutions and withdrawal from democratic participation.
The real danger of the Great Reset conspiracy theory's technological dimension is not that it identifies threats that do not exist. Many of the threats it identifies are real. The danger is that by attributing these threats to a coordinated conspiracy, the theory undermines the democratic engagement that is the most effective response to them. Citizens who believe that their governments are infiltrated by WEF operatives implementing a predetermined totalitarian plan are less likely to participate in the policy debates, legislative processes, and civic organizations through which technology governance is actually shaped. The conspiracy theory, paradoxically, makes the outcomes it fears more likely by discouraging the democratic participation that would prevent them.
The lesson of the Great Reset's technological dimension is that legitimate concerns and conspiracy theories can share the same raw material while producing entirely different conclusions and entirely different responses. CBDCs could enable surveillance, but democratic governance can prevent that outcome. Smart city infrastructure could be used for social control, but regulatory frameworks can limit its application. The difference between a citizen concerned about digital privacy and a citizen convinced that the Great Reset is being implemented is not the evidence they have seen, but the framework through which they interpret it. One framework leads to engagement, the other leads to despair. Every conspiracy theory needs a villain, and the Great Reset conspiracy theory has cast Klaus Martin Schwab, born March 30, 1938, in Ravensburg, Germany, as the mastermind behind the planned demolition of democratic capitalism and its replacement with a techno-feudal surveillance state. Schwab's biography is, in reality, that of an academic technocrat, a double doctorate in engineering and economics, a career in international business education, and a lifetime of institutional building that produced the World Economic Forum, the most successful private convening organization in history. But in the conspiracy theory ecosystem, Schwab is not a professor who organized conferences. He is a Bond villain who organized the world.
The conspiracy theory's portrayal of Schwab draws on his public persona in ways that are sometimes accurate and sometimes distorted. Schwab's communication style is genuinely technocratic, grandiose, and sometimes tone-deaf to democratic sensibilities. He speaks in sweeping abstractions about the Fourth Industrial Revolution, about the fusion of physical, digital, and biological worlds, and about the need for global governance mechanisms that transcend national boundaries. His German accent, his formal bearing, and his tendency towards statements that sound more authoritarian than he presumably intends have made him an easy target for meme culture. Internet communities have produced thousands of mocking images and videos portraying Schwab as a cartoon villain, complete with his trademark dark suit and spectacles. The penetrate the cabinet remark is the single most damaging thing Schwab has ever said publicly. In the context of the Harvard interview, the remark was clearly meant to express pride in the WEF's Young Global Leaders program, the organization's success in identifying individuals who went on to hold positions of governmental authority. But the word penetrate, with its connotations of infiltration and violation, transformed a boastful comment about institutional success into an apparent confession of democratic subversion. Schwab has never adequately addressed the remark's reception, and the WEF's failure to proactively contextualize and explain the comment allowed the conspiracy interpretation to become dominant. Schwab's intellectual framework, particularly the concept of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, has provided conspiracy theorists with additional ammunition. The Fourth Industrial Revolution, as described by Schwab in his 2016 book of the same name, refers to the ongoing transformation of society through the convergence of artificial intelligence, robotics, the Internet of Things, biotechnology, nanotechnology, and other emerging technologies. Schwab's argument is that this transformation is occurring at a speed and scale that requires new governance frameworks that bring together government, business, and civil society to manage the transition responsibly. To conspiracy theorists, the Fourth Industrial Revolution is not a description of technological change, but a prescription for technological control, a plan to merge the physical and digital worlds in ways that enable total surveillance and the elimination of human privacy and autonomy.
The question of whether Schwab is actually powerful enough to implement the agenda attributed to him by the conspiracy theory deserves honest assessment. Schwab is the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, a private Swiss foundation. He has no governmental authority, commands no military forces, controls no intelligence agencies, and has no enforcement mechanism beyond the power of persuasion and the attractiveness of the WEF's networking platform. His actual power is the power of convening, the ability to bring powerful people together and to set the agenda for their discussions. This is not a trivial power, but it is a qualitatively different power from the ability to dictate government policy across democratic countries. The conspiracy theory confuses the power to suggest with the power to compel. Schwab's age and career trajectory also undermine the conspiracy theory's narrative logic. Born in 1938, Schwab was 82 years old when the Great Reset was launched and is approaching 90. He has spent over 5 decades building the WEF as an institutional platform. The suggestion that he's the mastermind of a plot to overthrow global democracy is, when considered against his actual career, which has been dedicated to incremental, technocratic, institution-based reform, implausible in a way that transcends the usual objections to conspiracy theories. Schwab is, by all available evidence, exactly what he appears to be, a German academic who built an important conference and is sometimes careless about how he expresses his ambitions for it. The conspiracy theory's construction of Schwab as a villain follows a pattern common to personalized conspiracy theories, the need for an identifiable human agent behind complex systemic processes. The global economic system, with its multilateral institutions, interlocking financial networks, and complex governance structures, is genuinely difficult to understand. Attributing its operations to a single individual, a mastermind who pulls the strings, satisfies the cognitive need for agency and intentionality. If the world is unfair, if the economy seems rigged, if democratic processes feel captured by elite interests, then there must be someone who rigged it, someone who captured it. Schwab, with his conferences and his books and his young global leaders and his unfortunate choice of verbs, provides a conveniently visible target for anxieties that have far deeper and more diffuse structural causes.
The real Klaus Schwab is neither the benign conference organizer his defenders claim, nor the totalitarian mastermind his critics fear. He is something more ordinary and more interesting, a man who has spent his life trying to influence global governance through private institutional channels, who has achieved considerable success in that goal, and whose success has created legitimate democratic accountability questions that deserve serious engagement rather than dismissal as conspiracy theory. The question is not whether the WEF influences global policy. It clearly does. The question is whether that influence is legitimate, whether it is adequately transparent, and whether democratic institutions have sufficient mechanisms to counterbalance it. These are important questions. They deserve better answers than Klaus Schwab is a supervillain. The memification of Schwab, his transformation into an internet villain, a cartoonish figure of fun and fear, has had the paradoxical effect of both amplifying and undermining the legitimate concerns about the WEF's democratic accountability. By reducing the question of global governance to the question of one man's villainy, the conspiracy theory makes the structural issue personal and therefore dismissible.
Critics who raise legitimate concerns about the WEF's influence can be lumped together with conspiracy theorists who believe Schwab is a literal reptilian agent or a Nazi descendant planning world domination. The meme has consumed the message. The villain has eclipsed the problem. The World Economic Forum is a private Swiss foundation registered in Geneva under Swiss civil law. It has no governmental authority, it cannot pass laws, it cannot issue regulations, it cannot compel any government, corporation, or individual to do anything. It has no military forces, no intelligence agencies, no police powers, and no enforcement mechanism of any kind. Its annual revenue is approximately $350 million, a fraction of the budget of a medium-sized city government. Its permanent staff numbers approximately 800 people. By every institutional measure, the WEF is a conference organizer with delusions of grandeur, not a shadow world government with the power to implement a great reset.
The WEF's actual institutional mechanisms are well documented and entirely conventional. The forum operates through three primary channels. First, its convening function, the annual meeting at Davos, regional meetings around the world, and industry-specific gatherings that bring together decision-makers for discussion and networking. Second, its research and publication function. The WEF produces reports, white papers, and policy recommendations on a wide range of global issues, from economic competitiveness to climate change to technological governance. Third, its initiative function. The WEF launches multi-stakeholder initiatives, voluntary collaborations between governments, corporations, and civil society organizations that address specific challenges like deforestation, digital literacy, or pandemic preparedness. None of these mechanisms involve the exercise of governmental authority or the imposition of binding obligations. The WEF's recommendations are recommendations. They carry moral authority and networking influence, but no legal force. Governments that adopt WEF-recommended policies do so through their own democratic processes, subject to their own legislative constraints and their own electoral accountability. The conspiracy theory's fundamental error is confusing influence with authority, treating the fact that some governments adopt WEF-promoted ideas as evidence that the WEF directs those governments, when the actual mechanism is persuasion through a network that governments voluntarily participate in. The legitimate critiques of the WEF are more nuanced and more serious than the conspiracy theory acknowledges. Political scientists have documented the revolving door between Davos and government, the phenomenon whereby corporate executives influence government policy through WEF networking, then return to the private sector to benefit from the policies they helped shape. International relations scholars have criticized the WEF's multi-stakeholder governance model as a mechanism for corporate capture of public policy, giving corporations and billionaires a seat at the governance table that they have not earned through democratic processes. These are genuine democratic accountability concerns. They deserve rigorous analysis, not dismissal as conspiracy theory, and not inflation into claims of totalitarian world government.
The WEF's influence is real but limited. Its ideas circulate among decision-makers because those decision-makers voluntarily attend its events, read its publications, and participate in its initiatives. When multiple governments adopt similar policies, the explanation may involve WEF influence, but it may also involve shared exposure to the same academic research, the same international organizations, the same global challenges, and the same policy debates. The convergence of policy across democratic countries is not, in itself, evidence of conspiracy. It is evidence that democratic countries facing similar challenges often arrive at similar solutions, a phenomenon that predates the WEF by centuries.
The WEF's own communications have at times contributed to the perception that it is more powerful and more intentional than it actually is. Schwab's rhetoric about shaping the future, redesigning systems, and the Great Reset itself projects an image of transformative agency that exceeds the forum's actual institutional capacity. The WEF's marketing materials, annual reports, and public communications are designed to maximize the forum's perceived importance, to justify the high membership fees that fund its operations, and to attract the high-profile participants whose presence gives the forum its cachet. This institutional self-promotion is common to all organizations of this type, but it has the unintended consequence of providing conspiracy theorists with primary source material that appears to confirm their claims of WEF omnipotence. The distinction between what the WEF says it will do and what it can actually do is the key to understanding the Great Reset debate. The WEF says it will reshape the global economy, redesign capitalism, and build back better. What it can actually do is publish reports, host conferences, and hope that its recommendations are voluntarily adopted by sovereign governments through their own democratic processes. The gap between ambition and capacity is enormous, but it is the ambition, not the capacity, that the conspiracy theory seizes upon. By quoting the WEF's most grandiose statements and ignoring its institutional limitations, the conspiracy theory creates the impression of an organization that is far more powerful than reality supports.
The most honest assessment of the WEF's institutional role would acknowledge both its real influence and its real limitations. The WEF does influence global policy through agenda setting, networking, and the dissemination of ideas. Some of that influence raises legitimate democratic accountability concerns, but the WEF does not control global policy. It lacks the institutional mechanisms to do so, and the democratic governments it interacts with retain their sovereignty, their legislative processes, and their electoral accountability. The Great Reset conspiracy theory takes a real institution, exaggerates its power, attributes malicious intent to its stated goals, and ignores the democratic constraints that limit its operations. The result is a theory that feels powerful because it contains elements of truth, but is ultimately misleading because it substitutes caricature for analysis. The lesson for democratic governance is clear. Institutions like the WEF occupy a gray zone between public accountability and private privilege that democratic societies have not yet figured out how to govern effectively. The WEF is not a government, but it influences governments. It is not accountable to voters, but it shapes the policies that affect voters' lives. This gray zone is real, it is problematic, and it deserves serious institutional reform. More transparency in WEF operations, stronger conflict of interest regulations for government officials who attend Davos, and clearer democratic oversight of the policies that emerge from elite networking forums. These reforms would address the legitimate concerns that fuel the conspiracy theory without requiring anyone to believe that Klaus Schwab is a supervillain. The Great Reset conspiracy theory made specific predictions about the near future, predictions that can be evaluated against what has actually happened. The theory predicted that COVID lockdowns were the permanent new normal, that vaccine passports would become mandatory digital identity systems, that central bank digital currencies would replace cash and enable total financial surveillance, that private property would be systematically abolished, that citizens would be confined to 15-minute city zones, and that a one-world government would be established under WEF direction.
Several years have now passed since these predictions were made. The results are in, and the world of 2025 looks nothing like the dystopia the conspiracy theory described.
COVID lockdowns have ended in virtually every democratic country. The temporary restrictions on movement, commerce, and assembly that characterized 2020 and 2021 have been lifted. Schools have reopened, businesses have reopened, international travel has resumed. The emergency powers that governments exercised during the pandemic have been largely relinquished, in some cases voluntarily, in others under pressure from courts, legislatures, and public opinion. The prediction that lockdowns were a permanent feature of the Great Reset agenda has been definitively falsified by subsequent events. Vaccine passport systems have been discontinued in most countries that implemented them. The digital health pass infrastructure that conspiracy theorists identified as the prototype for a permanent surveillance system has been largely dismantled. Some countries have retained the technical infrastructure for potential future use, raising legitimate questions about data retention and surveillance creep. But the prediction that vaccine passports would evolve into mandatory digital identity systems controlling all aspects of citizens' lives has not materialized. The systems were temporary, contested, and ultimately reversed through democratic processes. Central bank digital currency development has continued, but at a pace and in forms that bear little resemblance to the conspiracy theory's predictions. The digital yuan is in advanced trials in China, but its adoption has been slower than projected, and Chinese citizens have shown limited enthusiasm for the technology. The European Central Bank's digital euro project remains in the research and design phase, with privacy provisions as a central design principle. The U.S. Federal Reserve has not launched a CBDC and faces significant congressional opposition to doing so. The prediction that CBDCs would rapidly replace cash and enable total financial surveillance has not been realized, and the democratic debates surrounding CBDCs suggest that the most extreme surveillance applications are unlikely to be implemented in democratic countries.
Private property has not been abolished. Home ownership, business ownership, vehicle ownership, and personal property ownership continue to function in exactly the same legal frameworks that existed before the Great Reset was announced. No democratic government has proposed the abolition of private property. The WEF itself has not called for the abolition of private property. The prediction that the Great Reset would eliminate property rights was based on the misinterpretation of a speculative article about sharing economies and has no basis in any proposed or implemented policy. 15-minute city proposals have continued to be developed and debated through democratic urban planning processes, with public consultation and with no restrictions on citizens' freedom of movement. The protests against 15-minute cities in Oxford and other cities demonstrated that democratic pushback against unpopular policies works. The policies were modified in response to public input, which is exactly how democratic governance is supposed to function. No city has implemented movement restrictions based on the 15-minute city concept. The prediction that 15-minute cities would become open-air prisons has been contradicted by the actual implementation of every 15-minute city project worldwide. The world of 2025 does not have a one-world government. National sovereignty remains the organizing principle of the international system. The United Nations, the World Health Organization, and the World Economic Forum remain advisory and convening bodies without enforcement authority. Democratic elections continue to take place. Governments change through electoral processes. Opposition parties operate freely. The press operates freely.
The prediction that the Great Reset would establish a totalitarian world government by 2025 or by any specific date has been falsified by the continued functioning of democratic institutions worldwide.
The conspiracy theory's response to these falsifications follows a predictable pattern. The timeline shifts. Each failed prediction is not abandoned, but postponed. The Great Reset is not happening now, but it will happen soon. The lockdowns ended, but they will return during the next pandemic. The vaccine passports were discontinued, but the infrastructure remains in place for reactivation. The CBDCs are not yet deployed, but they are coming. This pattern, the perpetual deferral of predicted events into the indefinite future, is the hallmark of unfalsifiable theories. A theory that can accommodate any evidence, including the failure of its own predictions, is not a theory that can be tested. It is a belief system that sustains itself through the permanent anticipation of vindication. The real Great Reset, if we use the phrase to describe what has actually changed in the global economy since 2020, is far more mundane than either the WEF's ambitious rhetoric or the conspiracy theory's apocalyptic predictions. The pandemic accelerated certain pre-existing trends: the growth of remote work, the digitization of commerce, the consolidation of market power by large technology companies, and the expansion of government debt. These changes have real consequences for workers, businesses, and democratic governance, but they are the consequences of a pandemic and pre-existing economic trends, not the implementation of a coordinated plan by a Swiss conference organizer. The real reset was not planned, it simply happened. The Great Reset conspiracy theory is wrong in its specific claims. The WEF is not implementing a totalitarian world government. Klaus Schwab is not a supervillain. Vaccine passports were not the first step toward permanent digital enslavement. Private property is not being abolished. The theory's predictions have been systematically falsified by subsequent events. And yet, and this is the fact that debunkers must honestly confront, the theory resonated with tens of millions of people for reasons that go far deeper than misinformation or cognitive failure. The Great Reset conspiracy theory is a symptom of a genuine crisis, a crisis of trust between citizens and their governing institutions that has been building for decades and that the pandemic made impossible to ignore.
The trust deficit is real, and it is measured. The Edelman Trust Barometer, the most comprehensive global survey of institutional trust, has documented a steady decline in trust in government, media, business, and non-governmental organizations across most democratic countries over the past 2 decades. In the United States, trust in the federal government has declined from approximately 75% in the early 1960s to approximately 20% in the 2020s. Similar declines have been recorded in the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and other Western democracies. Citizens are not becoming less intelligent or more paranoid. They are responding rationally to a pattern of institutional behavior that has repeatedly violated their trust. The specific grievances that fuel the Great Reset conspiracy theory are, in many cases, legitimate and well documented. Economic inequality has increased dramatically in most Western democracies over the past 40 years, with the share of national income captured by the top 1% growing substantially while middle-class wages have stagnated. The revolving door between government and corporate lobbying has been extensively documented by political scientists. The concentration of media ownership in the hands of a few corporations has reduced the diversity of perspectives available to citizens.
The influence of money in politics through campaign contributions, lobbying, and the funding of think tanks and advocacy organizations has been documented by scholars across the political spectrum. These are not conspiracy theories. They are the findings of mainstream academic research. The pandemic intensified these pre-existing grievances in specific and predictable ways. Small businesses were forced to close while large corporations, particularly technology companies, reported record profits. Workers in essential but low-paid occupations were exposed to the virus while knowledge workers stayed safely at home. Governments exercised emergency powers with limited legislative oversight. Pharmaceutical companies received billions in public funding and then charged market prices for their vaccines. The wealth of the world's billionaires increased by approximately $5 trillion during the first 2 years of the pandemic, while millions of ordinary workers lost their jobs and their savings. These distributional consequences were not the result of a conspiracy. They were the predictable outcome of applying pandemic restrictions to an already unequal economic system. But they felt conspiratorial to those who bore the burden.
The Great Reset conspiracy theory fills the gap between these real grievances and the failure of democratic processes to address them. If wages have stagnated for 40 years, if inequality has grown to levels not seen since the Gilded Age, if money corrupts politics and corporate interests capture regulation, and if democratic institutions seem unable or unwilling to reverse these trends, then the conspiracy theory offers an explanation. The system is not failing through the ordinary dynamics of democracy and capitalism. The system has been deliberately designed to produce these outcomes by people who meet on a mountaintop in Switzerland and plan the world's future over champagne and fondue. The conspiracy theory is wrong, but the conditions it describes are real. The failure of mainstream political institutions to take these grievances seriously has created a vacuum that conspiracy theories rush to fill. When economists describe rising inequality as an inevitable consequence of globalization and technological change, they may be analytically correct, but politically tone-deaf. When politicians promise reform and then pursue policies that benefit their donors, they generate the cynicism that makes conspiracy theories attractive. When media organizations dismiss conspiracy theorists as ignorant or crazy rather than engaging with the legitimate anxieties that drive their beliefs, they confirm the conspiracy theory's claim that the establishment is not listening. The Great Reset conspiracy theory is, in part, a communication from people who feel unheard, a desperate, distorted attempt to articulate real grievances in the only framework that seems to take those grievances seriously. The anti-Semitic dimension of the Great Reset conspiracy theory represents its most dangerous element and demands specific attention. The identification of George Soros and the Rothschild family as the financial architects of the Great Reset connects the theory to centuries of anti-Semitic conspiracy thinking. This connection is not incidental, it is structural. The conspiracy theory's narrative of a secret financial elite controlling governments and engineering crises for profit mirrors the narrative structure of the protocols of the Elders of Zion and other anti-Semitic conspiracy texts. The fact that some adherents of the Great Reset theory explicitly promote anti-Semitic content, while others reject anti-Semitism, does not eliminate the theory's role as a gateway to anti-Semitic radicalization.
The constructive response to the Great Reset conspiracy theory requires addressing both its false claims and its true grievances. Debunking the theory's specific claims. No, the WEF does not control governments. No, private property is not being abolished. No, Klaus Schwab is not implementing a totalitarian plan. Is necessary, but insufficient. The underlying conditions that make the theory attractive must also be addressed. Economic inequality must be reduced through progressive taxation and robust social safety nets. Corporate influence over democratic politics must be curtailed through campaign finance reform and lobbying restrictions. Institutional transparency must be increased, and citizens must be given genuine voice in the decisions that affect their lives. The alternative to conspiracy theory is not uncritical trust in existing institutions. The alternative is democratic engagement, the hard, slow, frustrating work of participating in democratic processes, holding elected officials accountable, supporting independent journalism, and building the civic infrastructure that makes self-governance possible. The Great Reset conspiracy theory is a shortcut. It provides the emotional satisfaction of understanding what is wrong without requiring the effort of fixing it. Democratic engagement provides no such shortcut. It is difficult, unglamorous, and often disappointing. But it is the only mechanism that has ever successfully addressed the concentration of power, the corruption of institutions, and the erosion of democratic accountability. The conspiracy theory offers the illusion of understanding. Democracy offers the possibility of change. The Great Reset is not what the conspiracy theory claims it is, but neither is it what the WEF claims it is. The truth lies somewhere between the conspiracy theory's apocalyptic vision and the WEF's technocratic optimism. In the messy, contested, imperfect reality of democratic governance in an era of rapid technological change, rising inequality, and declining institutional trust. The challenge for democratic societies is not to choose between the conspiracy theory and the WEF's agenda, but to build the democratic capacity to shape the future through transparent, accountable, and genuinely representative institutions. The Great Reset we actually need is not a plan from Davos. It is a renewal of the democratic processes that give ordinary citizens power over the decisions that shape their lives. That reset has not yet begun, but it is the only one worth fighting for.